There are some very reasonable people who say that, oh, you should print out everyone's credit card statements and get a highlighter and say, well, you don't really need that, do you? And like
Oh
go
God.
line by line. Very unpleasant, very invasive. I think a lot of people have been convinced like, oh, if you could just stop buying lattes and avocado toast, you could become rich. And, people need to get deprogrammed a little bit from that and realize the math doesn't add up and we might be fighting over very minor things.
Do you think money takes up more life space than it should? On this show, we discuss with and share stories from artists, authors, entrepreneurs, and advisors about how they mindfully minimize the time and energy spent thinking about money. Join your host, Jonathan Dio, and learn how to put money in its place and get more out of life.
Hey, welcome back on this episode of the Mindful Money Podcast. I'm chatting with Scott Rick. Scott's a marketing professor at the University of Michigan's Ross School of Business. Holds a PhD in behavioral decision research from Carnegie Mellon University. He's published research in journals spanning marketing, psychology, and neuroscience. He's got awards for both research and teaching, and his research is covered extensively in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, NPR, all over the place. I wanted to have him on the podcast to discuss the book, Tightwads and Spendthrifts, Navigating the Money Minefield in Real Relationships, because I'm married and we have these issues. So this was published in January of 2024 by St. Martin's Press. Scott, welcome to the Mindful Money Podcast.
Jonathan, thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to have the conversation. I expect that by the end of this, I will know how to discuss this topic with my wife. What do you think?
We're going to sort it out.
We'll sort it out.
Got it.
We don't have that many issues with it, but just to be clear. So first, where do you call home and where are you connecting from?
Nowadays, I live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and that's where I am now. We are doing a lot of swimming and baseball with the kids, so we're around a lot this summer.
It's nice and hot, right now?
Oh, very much.
Yeah, too hot. That's why the swimming. Where'd you grow up?
Houston. Grew up in Houston, and yeah, so this is a big change. I miss the people, but I don't miss the weather. I didn't love the storms and all that. But yeah, it's been some formative months in Vegas. My grandparents lived near us in Houston, but they kind of got bored and moved to Vegas. And that was sad, but we got to visit them quite a bit.
Yeah, we're gonna hear that. I'm gonna ask about that story in a second. So don't go too deep. I'm curious, while you're in Houston, how many years did you live in Houston? Like all growing up?
Yeah, till I was 22.
Okay. What did you learn about money in, as a kid, even through teenage years?
I was in a neighborhood where we were certainly less financially well off than pretty much everyone around us. And luckily my parents they were able to move into the most affordable part of like really good school districts. And so that was very nice. But no, it was kind of fascinating to see the variation in how parents spent their money and let their kids spend money, contrasting that with mine. From a very early age, was kind of fascinated in the different approaches people took. And I found it kind of confusing why some people with tons of money and felt very anxious about spending it sometimes. And it didn't really add up to me because we were in the opposite situation where we didn't have that much. And, the brakes on the car did not work so well, so to speak. And,
yeah. I think I grew up in a similar circumstance where most of my peer group, like my dad had overalls that were always dirty. My friends at school, parents were bankers and real estate agents, and so they looked cleaner. And I carry that image with me constantly. Can you name an experience as a kid that becomes part of that money story, whether it's you comparing what you got to a friend or something like that, or shopping with mom or whatever?
I forget how old I was, but I remember being in someone's car. They had like a backup camera. And I was like, what on earth? Because our car, we'd have to sometimes pour fluids in it because it was leaking just to get it to start and that kind of thing. But no, I mean, yeah, I did a lot of shopping, a lot of, we went to the mall a lot. We went to a lot of garage sales and never went overboard, but it was just kind of an open joke that the whole family was a little looser with money than maybe we should be. And so it wasn't stigmatized or anything. It was just kind of, well, why not?
Right.
That kind of approach. Yeah.
How has that informed how you work with your kids and money?
Yes. Well, I think I was hoping early on with the kids that I could not really change myself and just kind of give them verbal guidance on what to do differently. Kind of do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah.
But as I've discovered, both at the home and in relevant research, they're much more likely to mimic what they see than kind of any conflicting verbal instructions. And so, yeah, it's reeled me in a little bit. When we do kind of splurge, if you will, we'll talk through it and I'll let them know, like, okay, this is good, okay to do, but it might mean we give up something else later, and think about the trade-offs.
Yeah.
Money doesn't grow on trees, that kind of thing. And, I think that's helped them kind of think about prices in terms of what we call opportunity cost, what we're giving up later. And yeah, it's very different than what I had growing up, and I think it's a good thing.
I'm wondering, what age do you introduce the word opportunity cost?
Yeah. No, I don't think I have.
5 years old or what?
I might have tried at some point, but no, we just talk about it in very concrete terms.
Yeah.
Like, okay, we want to go to a Tigers game and get good seats, and that's fine, but put that in terms of, okay, well, maybe we don't go see that movie you've wanted to see, and we wait on that till it comes out on streaming or something. So yeah, just very concrete thing.
Yeah. I want to talk about Tightwads and Spendthrifts, but just before that, can you tell us what led to writing the book to begin with? I especially like the story about Grandma Molly and
Yes. Well, I mean, that was a fascinating thing. So yeah, they moved to Vegas, and in their work lives, they used to run like a movie house around Detroit, and they were just used to kind of glitz and glamour, and they were out there talking to people. It was very different than movie theaters nowadays. And they ran a restaurant. They just needed the action. And I got to go out there, and we would spend like a good chunk of the summer for several years hanging out and in casinos, not like, Hoover Dam. It wasn't about like the scenery of Vegas. It was the casinos. And yeah, I got this upfront view of people kind of pursuing happiness via money, and some were going overboard. And, I don't think we ever did anything too crazy, but it was kind of very constant. And for whatever reason, I think I looked older than I was. The security guards didn't give me a hard time. So I kind of got to linger in those spaces. They didn't like make me go somewhere else. And so I would, sometimes they would go play bingo, and I would just hang out in the sports book and watch all the baseball games. And that was great, actually. Yeah. So that was a really interesting thing. Then go back to Houston, and people aren't spending that way, and like, what's going on here? So it started young, the interest. And then I think I just got to a point in my kind of research life where it's like, okay, I think we know enough now. We don't know everything, but I think we know enough where I'm in a position where I can kind of give some informed advice that might be a little different than what is already out there.
Going back to the story, there's something about, was it your grandpa was hiding spending?
Oh yeah, my grandma. Yeah, so she was a little looser with money than grandpa. So, when we weren't at the casinos, we might go to the Fashion Show Mall in Vegas. I think it had a few slot machines itself, but, sometimes she would buy a designer outfit, keep it in the trunk until he was kind of somewhere else, and then kind of get the price tags off and put it in the closet. And she didn't like spend to extreme excess. She wasn't endangering anything. She was just kind of avoiding, in her mind, unnecessary arguments. I'm not sure I would prescribe that exact approach, but I think there is something to kind of knowing in a general sense what everyone's up to without getting into the details. I think that's one of the novel perspectives in the book. But yeah, hers was a little more kind of outlawish.
Yeah.
approach.
And there's another story, Jonathan and Aaron. Can you tell
Iran? Yeah, Iran. Yeah.
Iran. Yeah, tell us that story real quick.
Well, yeah, my two best friends were very different in their approaches. Jonathan was in the USA Today, an article where they talked about people who bought TVs so big that they kind of endangered their marriage. And so he bought like this giant TV. His wife, Emily, was really upset. So he bought her like a diamond ring to make up for it, like a very spendthrift way to kind of smooth things over. He was with me in Vegas for my 21st birthday. And then my other buddy, Iran, he was just kind of came from a family that was comfortable on paper, but they were just very reluctant to spend. And
Hmm.
he was just kind of fascinated with me and very puzzled. I would do things like, I'm a big fan of Pearl Jam. And at one point they put out a bunch of individual CDs from each of their concerts on a tour. And I would buy several of those, even though the set lists were pretty much the same. And he would be like, what, why, how? I'd be like, well, no, might play the same song in different places, but they would play it at different times. And the vibe was totally different. And I wanted to hear each of those. Like, of course I would buy several versions. So yeah, I was a source of puzzlement for him. And that just added to my fascination with the differences that are out there.
Yeah, yeah. So introduce us to the concepts. Like, what is a tightwad? What's a spendthrift?
Yes. Well, a classic tightwad is someone who might look good on paper. They might have all their accounts in order. You might not think by looking at them that they would be very worried or anxious about spending money, but a true tightwad is quite anxious about it, and they might end up not buying things that they recognize that they should buy, and certainly the people around them might recognize that they should buy it. And this can be a source of frustration and regret for them. And so it's kind of a sometimes uncomfortable thing to be. Contrast that with a spendthrift who does not experience enough distress when thinking about spending money. We are a little more present-minded, whereas a tightwad might be kind of worried about, robbing their future self of enough money to live. A spendthrift might be worried about robbing their future self of a life, memories, experiences. So they're both trying to avoid something bad for that later person, but in very different ways. And spendthrifts do a lot of what I might call just in case purchasing. We might buy something just in case we happen to need it sometime. I might be shopping for work clothes and then see this lovely velvet blazer that might be cool for like a holiday party. I'd love to have that. I'm not invited to such a party. Probably won't be. But boy, I'd hate to miss out on it. So the spendthrift saying is, I'd rather be looking at it than looking for it. That helps us feel kind of safe. And as you can imagine, that can also lead to quite a bit of regret and trouble. So it's neither one is like totally ideal, I would say.
Are we all one or the other, or is there a lot of gray area in between?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
There's a lot of in-between gray area. The third group of people who are kind of in the middle, we call them unconflicted consumers. They don't get a fun name because they're not as interesting. They're kind of happy. They have some distress when thinking about spending money, but not too little, not too much. And they're kind of at peace with how they use money. And they are kind of happiest on average. And so, their name implies that both the extremes, the tightwads and spendthrifts, they're the ones experiencing a lot of conflict.
What are some of the, I guess, underlying psychological and neurological factors that shape spending personalities?
I think tightwads do have a more mathematical mind. They're more likely to major in mathy things in college. They are just more money minded in general. They're just kind of more obsessed with money. Yeah, I think that helps you view prices in terms of opportunity cost if you have this mathematical lens. There are some demographic correlates, like women are a little more likely to be spendthrifts than men. It's not huge, but it's always there. There are plenty of male spendthrifts running around and female tightwads, but there's a small relationship. A small relationship with age. Tightwads are usually a little older. That could just be a generational thing rather than something that happens as you age. But one interesting thing that it doesn't correlate with is your current income. A lot of people, when they hear this, they might think tightwads are just people who don't have money to spend. And it is not about your current income. There are plenty of tightwads with a fabulous income and vice versa, but it's not about that. I think it's more about how you and your family kind of felt about money in your formative years rather than as an adult, whatever your current income happens to be.
So talk about that. How does your financial personality develop?
It can take shape early on, and it's hard to update when your circumstances change. And I like to quote this character from the story Love in the Time of Cholera. Uncle Leo, he grew up poor and, somehow worked himself up and became like this wealthy industrialist. At that point in his later years, people would say, well, you're rich. They said, no, I'm not rich. I'm a poor man with money. That's a very different thing. So
Mhm.
there are a lot of tightwads who have that approach. Like, I'm a poor person who happens to have money. And if you grew up struggling, sometimes you're just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Like, you might be comfortable now, but disaster can strike at any moment. So you don't feel comfortable in your own skin. And so, yeah, it can take hold pretty early. But I will say it's really interesting. Some people who struggle early, that stays with them and they're afraid of going broke again. Other people are afraid of, missing out on a life. And if they come into money, they want to they go all out. And so there's different paths people can take. And I will say that as a parent, you might think your kid is very different from you when they kind of leave the nest and go off to college or whatever they do as an adult. But I think eventually people kind of come back home, so to speak. It's hard to mimic everything your parents do when you're a young person. You can't mimic a bad mortgage when you're a teenager, but you can mimic it when it's your turn to get a house. And so I think that's when you start seeing people kind of fall back into what they saw early on.
I definitely tilt towards tightwad. I also totally identify with I'm a poor person that has money, grew up poor, still have that mindset. Are these changeable? How do I alter this?
Yeah. There are things you can do just on your own. Like when I was in grad school, the money dried up. It wasn't there. I couldn't work a side job, and I had to devote everything to school, and I had to train myself to be a tightwad just to get through that rough time. And I was able to do that to survive. I would either pay with cash or a debit card, and I would collect receipts. And even though the transaction would just kind of pop up on my account, I would go home and put it in Excel. I wanted to feel it, reducing my balance. And I would feel pain at the ATM, taking the money out, and feel pain when spending the cash at the store. And so just putting up all these speed bumps to slow me down, I shook that off once I got a decent income and got back to my normal self. But, there are these emergency measures you can take. I think the best way to kind of adjust, because I don't think people can really flip flop, but you can adjust through talking with other people with different perspectives, whether that's a spouse, a friend, a therapist, a planner. You need someone else because you can really talk yourself into some weird, wrong perspectives. So you need someone else to say, what? You can afford that, or no, you can't afford that. You need another view. That's what we say in psychology. That's the joke in academic psychology departments. Oh, you're fine. How am I? Instead of oh, how you doing? We need someone else to kind of give us feedback.
In a minute, we'll get into relationships, but
Yeah.
outside of relationships, in business, at the office, in friendships, how do the different behaviors or spending styles affect those areas of life?
It's sticky. You might think that, for example, in business, I might be tight with my money, but when I'm on the corporate card, I'm very loose. You might expect that, but no, there are what has been called expense account tightwads. Even it's hard to turn off this tendency when you're just using a different credit card, oh, this is company money. And that can actually be bad. If I'm trying to wow a client, I don't know, do I want to take him to Olive Garden or do I want to take him to somewhere, fancy? And sometimes you got to spend money to make money. And I think you want, as in marriage, as we'll discuss, you want different perspectives. You need a spendthrift orientation to invest and do new ventures and grow, but you also want to make sure you don't do a WeWork situation where you just totally recklessly. You want a balance of perspectives, a team of rivals. So yeah, that can be good. In friendship, you hear a lot of people saying, well, if I'm single, it's good to have accountability to friends, and maybe we talk once a week or month and check in with each other. And that can be a very helpful thing also.
Yeah. So let's talk about till death do us part. Do opposites attract, or do people find themselves attracted to similarities, or is that not part of the research?
Yeah, no, it's very much part. And the normal pattern just in life is birds of a feather flock together.
Yeah. Okay.
Republicans marry Republicans, Democrats marry Democrats. But it had been speculated that if there's something you don't like about yourself, and then you see that in someone else, it's a really uncomfortable mirror up to your own problem. And it can make you kind of shy away from that person. And so we think that's what's happening when a tightwad encounters another tightwad. It's oh, is that what I look like? That's terrible. So we think there's something fun and fascinating and just novel about being with someone who approaches money very differently. And indeed, we find that like a mismatched marriage, a tightwad and a spendthrift, is more common than two tightwads or two spendthrifts. So this is one case where opposites attract. Now the question is like, should they attract? Like, is it good for the marriage? It's mixed. Left to their own devices, if they don't think about things carefully, what was once kind of charming and kind of silly in dating, once there's like kids and houses and cars and bigger stakes things, it can start to get kind of irritating. So there is a pattern of fatal attraction that's out there. Sometimes the very thing that kind of interests you or draws you in is the same thing that kind of repels you later. And so if you're not careful about this stuff, a mismatched marriage could be kind of rough.
Yeah. What advice do you have for couples that are struggling with this mismatch?
Yes. Well, I actually think, so I'm in a mismatched marriage and it's great. And I think a mismatched marriage does provide the greatest potential for happiness because if you can take the best of both perspectives, that's the way to do it. And so, one thing that helps my wife and I function, we try to talk about things that we should talk about and not talk about things that we don't need to talk about. For example, we have very different hobbies, and she is a wonderful needle pointer. She's turning that into a business. Occasionally, I have seen invoices and receipts, and I've always been surprised. Like, I would assume, like, oh, it's just like thread, right? You can get that for like $5 at Michael's. Like, no, this is like specialty. I think they call it floss. Like, it's a different thing altogether. But she doesn't need me kind of looking over her shoulder and like saying, did you really have to spend that? Squashing her enjoyment of her thing. Just the opposite with me. I'm like a baseball card person. I do it with the kids. And, you can imagine someone saying, you spent that on a piece of cardboard? Like, no, not exactly. There's a market for it. So the way we do it is we have a joint account, but we have separate accounts attached to it. We know what's going from the joint to the separate. We know that number, but the details beyond that are just kind of available upon request. And hopefully the requests are kind of infrequent. So there's, it takes trust, but you hide the details and just keep things at a high level, what everyone knows. And I think it helps you avoid unnecessary friction over things that don't matter so much to the overall bottom line. So I think that approach, that mixed account approach, can be quite good, especially for mismatched couples.
How do you set the amount that you allow each other to spend without oversight?
Well, that's tricky. Some people ask like, oh, should it be equal? And I think not necessarily. Like, what if there's kids involved? Usually one spouse does more of the spending for kids. Oh, I got to register all 3 kids for baseball. And, that's $1,000. Like, it doesn't need to be equal. But ideally, the kind of amount that, if you're factoring in kind of what each person gets to spend on kind of their own individual pursuits, like the lunch they buy during their workday, or like lattes they buy, or their hobbies or side projects. Ideally, that amount is roughly similar. So there's some important discussions there. But once that number is kind of roughly agreed upon, then we're off to the races. You can always say, hey, it seems like we're both spending a little too much. Can we do like a self-audit? Just see kind of everyone looks over their own stuff. Is there places we can cut? Start there. And, if you want a second pair of eyes, you can say, oh, could you look at this? That's fine. But start by looking through your own stuff first.
Is there any advice for people in the midst of direct conflict, like right now?
If it's kind of a low trust, high conflict environment, that is when you need transparency. That is when it might help to kind of get everything out there. If you can afford to do so, maybe don't go it alone. Maybe try to get an outside planner or therapist perspective. It's a different set of recommendations if it's like an actively a negative situation.
If it's hot, then you need to find maybe help. Is it possible? I mean, the way you set up the bank account sort of avoids the deep conversations or it sidesteps it because it's not necessary. You have yours, I have mine. But is there a way for a spendthrift to understand a tightwad, or a tightwad to understand a spendthrift?
Well, I mean, hopefully that comes with the discussions about the big picture things. What are we putting aside in savings? What are we putting aside in the separate accounts? Hopefully there are useful overarching discussions there. If there is good communication, you can educate each other and talk each other into, adjusting their kind of gut response. And yeah, I'd like to think I've helped Julie, my wife, loosen up a little on like shared family experiences and like, investing in those stories and memories and kind of things. And I definitely have seen her point of view just by hearing her talk about her own shopping experience. Like when we were younger, she would come home and say, she would like go to the mall or go shopping and then tell me about all the things she wished she would have bought. Like, oh, okay, I see how you're thinking here. So those discussions provided some useful insight.
Huh. Maybe this is something you could talk about in your own relationship, but in the research, a couple's been together for quite a while. Maybe there's resentment that builds up. Is there any way to deal with that sort of long-standing underlying resentment?
It is true that, a lot of this, an ounce of prevention versus a pound of cure, like it's better to kind of get off on the right foot. But no, I think when you're in like a rut, you do need an outside perspective. And there are just things that couples cannot get through on their own. But I will say that, one place where resentment can come up is when there's like obviously unequal income and there's feelings about what's fair and whose money is whose. And so that's why I say, like with the joint account, I think the best thing to do with it is to have all incoming money routed through that joint account. So it's our money as soon as it comes in.
Right.
There is no yours and mine. And even with the separate account, it's still our money, but we each get to spend some of our money without the other person monitoring us. What I don't like is situations where, I chip in like 65% and you chip in 35%, because scorekeeping is really bad for a close relationship. That can really eat away at a lot of good things.
I work with clients, and one of the things they'll often tell us is, as financial planners, it's good to get those big picture things discussed. Yeah, we're planning for this. We're saving for this. There's the down payment of the house, retirement income, all that stuff. And then there's excess. There's extra stuff. And that's the stuff where you can actually, this is what you can spend, and you get some choices in that. And that's really, as long as we're covering the big things and some of the little things.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yes, of course.
There's an enormous amount of noise out there. And so I'm going to ask the impossible. Like, can you simplify this for us? There's a married couple or a couple about to get married. What's one thing that you would suggest to them that they should do today that would lead to more satisfaction in their joint financial lives?
If it's just one thing, I would say, look at your account structure, go to the bank and adjust it so that it's all our money. And you can have some discretion on some of the individual uses of our money. Things like, this Tightwads Spendthrift scale, you can take that, you can guess what your partner would say, you can have them take it, you can compare, and that can help you learn about each other and spark conversations, because not all couples will have like someone who comes home and say, I wish I would have bought this. Like she just phrased it like so perfectly. And so that can help spark greater understanding, but those are both things that can be done pretty quickly.
And just for clarity, that all the inflowing money goes into the joint account, and then then there's two separate accounts, his and hers, or hers and hers, or his and his, whatever, and they separate those out, and then some of the spending, personal spending, comes out of those, and that's like there's not a lot of oversight on that, which is good.
Exactly. The things like mortgage and utilities, that comes out of joints,
right?
But my spending, that's my separate account.
Right. And then so that's something to do. Set up the accounts. What's one thing that they might be doing together that they should stop doing?
I mean, it's just the flip side of this. Like, there are some very reasonable people who say that, you should print out everyone's credit card statements and get a highlighter and say, well, you don't really need that, do you? And go line by line. Very, very popular book. Yes. Very unpleasant, very invasive. So I think that is a bad thing. I think a lot of people have been convinced, if you could just stop buying lattes and avocado toast, you could become rich. And, people need to get deprogrammed a little bit from that and realize the math doesn't add up, and we might be fighting over very minor things. And so, I would avoid that kind of invasiveness if at all possible.
It just belies little trust. If you're having this lifetime relationship, you got to trust at least a little bit, unless someone's like shown really bad decision making. You got to develop that trust.
No, I need transparency with my contractor on my house, who I may or may not trust, and it's a temporary relationship, and I need to see the receipts for those materials that you said cost $5,000. So that's where you need it. But like, if you're in it for presumably a long time,
trust is important. So just for a wrap up, I'd like to come back to the personal. So is there anything that people don't know about you, or maybe you've told them you don't remember that you want them to know?
Yeah, I think I lay myself bare a little bit in the book in some new ways. But yeah, I'll just share a fun story. Like I have 3 kids, an older boy, and then 11, and then 8-year-old twins. And the twins came on the day that I was supposed to go to my dean and find out if I made tenure. I had that meeting like circled on the calendar for months. And then Julie went into labor like a couple weeks early. I was like, I'm conflicted here. But yeah, they called me at the hospital and gave me the good news. And then a couple hours later, the twins were born. And it's just one of those days where life could have gone in really different directions. But luckily, like, the coin landed on heads both times and everything worked out. But it was a big day. And yeah, I think things have been pretty good since then.
It's a good trajectory. It's a good launching pad.
Yeah.
What's the last thing you changed your mind about?
Yeah, the kids are constantly pushing boundaries and wanting to try new things, and things where I might by gut say, no, you can't handle that, or that's too dangerous. And so, yeah, I can't name something specific, but I'm often like convinced, like, okay, try it, go for it.
Try that. Yeah.
Yes.
That's actually really, really important. My kids are 19 and 16. I wish I would have done more of that. Okay, go for it.
Yeah.
They would have fallen down and skinned their knees more, and they'd be much more resilient now, right? That's the trade-off.
Right. Yes.
How do people connect with you, Scott?
Yeah, I'm around. I'm on all the socials, and happy to answer emails or messages on anything. And yeah, please do reach out if you're interested. Yeah.
Scott, I very much appreciate having you on. It was a great conversation. I hope people learned something about setting up accounts. I think that was the most concrete sort of, thing that people can do to make it simpler, but I appreciate your time.
Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. Full show notes for each episode, which includes a summary, key takeaways, quotes, and any resources mentioned, are available at mindful.money. Be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you're enjoying the content and getting value from these episodes, please leave us a rating and review at ratethispodcast.com/mindfulmoney. We'll be sure to read those out on future episodes.